Hey everyone, this is Mike, and today we're back in Lost Ark Online, as over the last few days I've gotten the same question a couple of times, considering the difficulty of the game. Like, is the game difficult in general? Is it hard to get into? Is there a specific beginner-friendly class that's good for a new player that is just getting into the genre? And how is the endgame like as well? So hopefully today I'm just going to be able to paint a picture as to how the endgame of the game is going to be, and then also in terms of how difficult a class could be to play. Because of course difficulty is something that is very subjective, and something that I find hard might be difficult for you or the other way around. So that's why I'm going to try and explain things as best as I can to just give you an idea of how the difficulty of the game is like. And I'll mainly be talking about just the tier 1 content, as that is the content that we will be getting at the launch of the global release of the game. So let's begin with classes. So I don't necessarily think that there is a best class to pick up for beginner players that are new to the ARPG genre, and the reason for that is because a lot of classes in Lost Ark are just very easy to pick up and play. I do know that if you're playing at endgame and you want to do the best DPS as possible, then certain classes will be harder to play as others, because some heavily rely on animation cancelling to get the best DPS out there, but in general there's no real need for you to be able to play at that high level just yet, at least not in our tier 1 content. As we go into the higher tiers, there will be more difficult content being added to the game, but I don't really think that playing your class at the best of your ability will ever become a requirement to actually clearing any content. So far in the tier 1 content, all of the DPS checks have been really lenient. Yes, boss fights do have an enrage, and there are also abilities that just can wipe a raid if you fail it, but in general I've never really failed a boss fight because we hit the enrage, because we just did not have the DPS required to clear it. So that's something that you shouldn't really be too afraid of. In terms of the class themselves, if you want to just play it yourself, it's best to just pick something that speaks to you in terms of the thematic of the class, or in terms of the gameplay that you've seen from the numerous gameplay videos that are out on YouTube at this point, or from just like the class introduction that you get when you are creating a character. Just pick something that speaks to you, because there's also the thing that you only get to use 8 abilities in a specific skill build, and there's like 20 or something like that. There's way more abilities out there than you can actually fit on your hotbar, so you just pick the 8 that speak the most to you. And on top of that, all of these skills can be upgraded as well, because as you invest skill points into these skills, you level them up, and as you level them up, you get access to the tripod system, which modifies your skills. These can be very simple modifiers, from making them deal more critical damage, changing the element from ice to fire so that they have a burn effect on them, but they can also fundamentally change the way that the skill works. Like for example on Sorceress, the Thunder skill that you sometimes see me casting can go from a casted ability to just an instant cast ability, so you don't have to worry about the cast times, and you can do this with a lot of the different abilities. So even if you want to play something like a mage, like you're seeing in the background, you can have a very cast time heavy build, which focuses on long cast times, being immobile but doing high damage if your skills hit. But you can also do the complete opposite, where you are a very mobile mage using mostly instant cast abilities, and that is the same class that you are playing. It's just going to be focusing around different abilities, and then also choosing different tripods to fit that playstyle that you are looking for. So when it comes down to choosing a class, just pick something that speaks to you, that you like thematically, or from like the little gameplay preview that you saw when creating your character, and then you can mold your build to what you prefer the most in terms of the skills that you're using, and in terms of how you are going to be modifying those 8 skills so that they best fit your playstyle. So that's the first thing. In terms of the general gameplay, Lost Ark is again fairly easy. You just run around. Most abilities can be dodged by just walking around the map. You also have a dodge button that does have a cooldown on it, but you can just use that to dodge into a position if you need to do so. And certain classes also have defensive abilities, like a counter stance, something that gives you a shield damage reduction, but then we're mostly talking about our supports over here. Usually when you're leveling up, you're mainly just going to be focusing on abilities that deal AoE damage, as a lot of the mobs in the game can be stunned whenever they take damage, but as you're fighting bosses or elites, those are immune to those knockback effects, then you will need to just be a bit more quick on your toes. A lot of your casted abilities or your animations can also be cancelled by using your dodge button, so even if you are locked in a big animation and you have to get out of the way of a boss doing his attack, you can just press your spacebar button to just dodge out of the way. So it's definitely not too punishing if you want to play a class that has long cast times like Mage, for example. In terms of the endgame content, there are 3 main pieces of content that you'll be focusing on when it comes down to upgrading your gear. I know that there's more out there like Cube and the Tower as well, but I'll mainly be talking about the Chaos Dungeons, the Guardian Raids and the Void Dungeons, as those are the 3 big pieces of content that you'll be focusing on in Tier 1 at least. Later on we'll also get Legion Raids, there's also more open world content and other daily quests that you can do and such, but we'll just talk about this content first. So in terms of Chaos Dungeons, this is the easiest piece of endgame content that there is. This is quite literally a mob grinder. You just go in, you pick a skill build that focuses a lot on doing AoE damage, as that is also going to be stunning most of these enemies in there, and then you just run around a bit, gather the mobs, and you just burn them down with whatever skills that you have. Comes in 3 different waves. The first one is just literally normal mobs. The second one does have some mini bosses, but they also die relatively fast. And then the final wave has a mob grind, and then you spawn a mini boss as well by destroying a crystal. But if you save some big skills for whenever those bosses spawn from the crystal, then again there's really not going to be anything that is too difficult in there. This is very simple gameplay. Moving on to the Guardian Raids. These are a little bit more difficult. You can do them alone or in a party up to 4 players, and you have a respawn limit, so you can die up to 3 times. If you die a 4th time, it's game over. I believe whenever you go into a party, as soon as 4 people die, it's also just game over and not the remaining 3 players can keep going or something like that. But I haven't actually done any of these in a party in a very long time. In terms of difficulty, they are harder than the Chaos Dungeons because these bosses all have their own mechanics, and instead of just being AoEs on the floor, you'll often have to look for tells that the bosses are doing, like for example a glowing tail, or they raise their head or something like that. You have to look at the boss and see what they are doing rather than just look for AoEs that are on the floor. Most of these attacks will just knock you down, do some damage, and you can just heal back up, but your healing is going to be limited because you can only bring 5 potions, and if those potions are consumed, you have to run back to the base to go and restock. And running back to base is something that you don't necessarily want to be doing when you're in the middle of a boss fight that also has an enrage, because you have 20 minutes to kill these, and then of course, if the 20 minutes are up, or if you die 4 times, then it is game over as well. But in general, I've never really come close to hitting the enrage on these bosses. I think the longest I've taken is like 14 minutes, and that was when I was just minimum item level on one of the harder bosses as well. So definitely very doable, especially when you're in a party. I have soloed the first 7 up to this point. The 8th one I only just unlocked, so I haven't tried that one yet. But it's definitely doable solo, and if you struggle solo, just go in with a party of 4 so you can benefit from all of the party effects, like debuffs on the boss, like damage reductions and shields on you from your support player, and then you should be quite good to go. The HP of these bosses do scale with your party size, but I have found that when you go solo versus when you go with 4 players, the boss's HP isn't going to go up 4 times. So going in with 4 players will always be more beneficial than going in alone, but I just like the solo experience in these kinds of games. So that's why I usually end up trying to solo these types of encounters. Again, the mechanics are there. Most of the things won't one-shot you, although some bosses do have one-shot mechanics that you will need to learn. But after you've seen it a few times, definitely shouldn't be something that you have to worry about too much in terms of a learning curve. You just see the mechanic a few times and you should know what needs to happen. All that needs to happen then is for you to execute on those mechanics as well. And that leads us into the Void Dungeons. These do have a bit more of a difficulty to them than the Guardian Raids again, and they also have a lot more one-shot mechanics. So if you fail mechanics, most of them will still just knock you down and deal some damage, but some of them will result in you just getting one-shot, or they might even wipe the party, and then you have to start all over again. Now, luckily enough, after each boss there is a checkpoint, so you don't have to worry too much about having to restart the whole dungeon, but even then a full dungeon run takes about 10-15 minutes if you are around the item level of the dungeon, so nothing that takes too long if people know what they are doing. In terms of the mechanics themselves and the boss fights, if you do end up dying, then you'll have to wait until the boss fight is over or until your party decides to restart. So dying in this is going to be very punishing because you can't respawn during the boss fight, meaning that the DPS check becomes harder. So you might just want to restart if someone does end up dying. For the most part, these one-shot mechanics don't occur too often. Like for example, in the dungeon that you're seeing in the background, the first boss has a one-shot mechanic that occurs like twice or maybe 4 times. Depends on how much DPS you are doing, but if your DPS is low, you'll see it 4 times because it's a 2-part mechanic and both of the waves can one-shot you. But once you're past that, you're good to go. And then the final boss also has a one-shot mechanic that happens twice. But you can also just outrange it if you bait the boss into a corner. The second time she does it, she automatically moves to the middle, so then you do have to deal with the mechanic. And then she has another one-shot mechanic that is a party mechanic where you have to like do a specific mechanic, aim your lantern towards a player and then dodge a meteor. But if you don't have enough players alive for that, or if one player messes up the positioning, then you would get killed by that as well. And then of course you will have to restart because it will also result in a party wipe. So those are some mechanics that you can expect. This is of course the hardest void dungeon as well. The other void dungeons before this are a lot easier. This is the only one where I really got walled, because the first 3 void dungeons I was just able to get in and get through it in the first try. This final dungeon took me like 4 hours of trying different groups before I finally found one that knew what they were doing in order to get through the mechanics, because knowing what you need to do is one thing, being able to execute it is another, and that is something that I did find was lacking a little bit. But I could just be unlucky because a lot of new players are coming into the game and they don't necessarily know that these mechanics are a thing. So Chaos Dungeons, no mechanics at all, just go in there, grind mobs, and that's it. Guardian Raids, they do have some mechanics, but for the most part it's just dodge AoEs that you see, look at the tells of the boss and you should be fine. Void Dungeons, these can have actual mechanics that will one-shot you, some will one-shot the whole party, so it is best to maybe look up a video before you go in these so that you know what to expect from the mechanics. And of course, otherwise just ask your teammates if there is anything that they need to pay attention to. But again, nothing too difficult. Just see it a couple of times, and if you are a competent player, you should be fine to go through these dungeons without too much trouble. And that is probably going to do it for this video. If you have any more questions, then feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. And if there is a follow-up video warranted, then I'll make one as well, but I don't necessarily think that that should be the case. Anyways, on that note, I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.